Hello, LMTs. It's Zena, and I have a video about weeding library books from the library. I'm going to have another series of videos that show you how to weed out of Follett. But the first thing I wanted to talk about is how do you know if a book actually should be taken off the shelf, if it should be weeded? Because we weed textbooks out of the system, but we also weed library books out of the system. And it's just going to depend on your particular library. The main emphasis is that we have a huge nonfiction section because we had libraries before there was internet. So we have lots of things on the shelf. And I wanted to give you an example of, I have three titles that I'm going to use in the next video, but I wanted to just talk to you a little bit about why would you read a library book. So I'm going to start with the first example. And remember, if you are ever questioning whether or not you want to weed a library book or if something should be removed from the system, you can always talk to Megan or myself, and we'd be happy to give you information. But this is just a little guide on how to know if something most likely needs to be weeded. My first example is the European discovery of America. So, one thing that I've noticed in Roseville, this could be an example of something that needs weeded simply because it's not politically correct. The history is not necessarily accurate anymore. This was huge scholarly study when this was written. I think in the I want to say this was written in the 1950s, but it might have been the early, let's see, yeah, late 60s. And the main thing is that a lot of these history anthologies, you can find information about this on the databases, so you really don't need the print book. But certain titles, I do think are problematic for that reason. So if it's something that you're questioning, I'm sure that probably in some libraries there are books about eugenics and types of research that was done to prove certain races were superior to other races, and that type of science doesn't exist anymore. But I'm sure that those type of things were put in libraries, just the same as there used to be titles in libraries about the way that anything with homosexuality was classified in Dewey. It used to be a mental disorder, and so librarians pushed to have that changed over. So just know that, like, if you see something that you think, oh, this title seems a little bit not relevant or not politically correct, you can pull it. You can weed it out of the library. So this is my first example. Um, my next example here is this book, The Purple Violet Squish of the Hippie Movement, the psychedelic view of God, and how the hippies really were actually people who replied that God is purple violet squish. So anything that's kind of like a pseudoscience or something that's just a little bit strange and doesn't represent the common era anymore. Common era meaning anything that we research, I'd say within, like, I don't know, probably 30 years from now. I'd say anything that was published before the 1990s, you could look at this and say, is this relevant, and is the information in this accurate? Like, if you were going to give a student a paper and they were going to write about the counterculture, would this be a resource that we'd want to use? Probably not. So for that reason, I would probably just remove this from the library. And it's older. Obviously, it was only $2.95 when it was purchased. So it can go. So some you could be weeding it because it's just not relevant, or it's so obscure that you don't really need to take the space up in the shelves, because especially when we're trying to move from the dynamic shelf, or we're trying to move from static shelving to dynamic shelving, this would be a candidate for me. I would say, okay, this thing can go because, yeah, the hippies. All right. And then the very last one. Now, there could be a reason, the anguish and joy of the Christian life. This could be the anguish and joy of a librarian's life. But one thing I wanted to point out is that it's really getting kind of ratty. So if there's any book to where the easiest weeding is just if something is beat up, right? And you could justify, all right, we got to get rid of it for that reason. The reason why this, I decided that it could be pulled, is simply because it was written by somebody in the 1930s in France, and it was translated in the 60s. This guy talks a lot about Muslims being wrong and all sorts of interesting stuff. Obviously, it's his opinion, but the one reason I think that we probably want to get rid of it is when I look here. Nobody's checked this book out since 1998, and that's a reason why I pulled this, simply because of the nature of the topic, and also that nobody's been checking it out for several years, so decades. If something's been on the shelf and is just sitting there for decades, the patrons aren't going for it. And anything that you wanted to look up about this particular author, you could find him in a database. So those are 3 examples. I'll use it in the next video. I hope this is helpful, just to talk a little bit about which library books would you want to read. So I'll see you in the next video, where I'll give you the nuts and bolts on how to actually get these things out of the Follett system. Happy weeding, LMTs.